if it were to end here, if this ceasefire ultimately ends in a lasting truce or cessation of hostilities, would you describe this as victory with a capital V?
I would, if we're able to get from Iran what's in our negotiating position. And I think what I've seen of public statements about the U.S. negotiating position and what we're going to demand of Iran is going to be free passage to the Strait of Hormuz, limitations on their nuclear program, limitations on their ballistic missile program, and limitations on the proxy exportation of terror across the region. If those conditions obtain, then clearly this will be a significant victory. And the hard part is ahead of us. Look, the Iranians are not great fighters. They've never been great fighters. They're brilliant negotiators, and they know how to negotiate. They grew up in a culture that is based on negotiation. They will now seek to draw negotiations out, change the terms, and create a new reality. And that's our task now will be to take the substantive operational victory which we have obtained and turn it into something lasting and strategic.
So you say, General, that the Iranians are not great fighters, and yet they had the world and global commerce and the companies that operate tankers that needed to go through the Strait of Hormuz believing that they posed a credible threat to the safety and security of those cargo and crews. And if even President Trump himself is saying that vessels need to be coordinating with Iranian armed forces if they want to pass, if Iran is openly talking about charging vessels to do so, is that not still a lever that Iran is going to be able to say it can pull at any time?
Iran has powerful geographic advantages based on where they are in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States Navy has the ability to open that strait and keep it open if required to do so. We haven't asked the Navy to do that just yet. That could still be in the future. Look, here we are less than really 24 hours into this ceasefire. It appears not to be holding completely on the Iranian side anyway. I'm going to be real interested to see what happens in the next 48, 72 hours if the Iranians are actually going to adhere to it. And that would be good if they did, because I think, as I've told you, there's a path forward here for negotiations. But part of that path is going to have to be opening the Strait of Hormuz. Should they choose not to do that, we do have the capability to open that strait.
Well, and beyond our capabilities to open the strait, the president also was suggesting that the U.S. military had the capability to wipe out, or in his words, kill, die a whole civilization. Obviously, we did not see him follow through on that threat with the agreement for this 2-week ceasefire, but our service members had to be ready for that, General. And I wonder if you were inside Central Command still, how you would have had to be prepared for 8 p.m. last night, and if you expect that they are still in that ready posture as we speak because of the fragility of this ceasefire.
So the job of a combatant commander is to give the president and the secretary of defense options, to give them military activities that will support the policy goals of the United States. I would argue that Central Command has done that over the last 30 days, brought us to this point in a really very effective military campaign against Iran. Now it's the task of our diplomats to take what we fashioned operationally and militarily, turn it into a lasting strategic outcome.
Well, and when we consider the strategic outcomes here, it's one thing to consider specifically what this means for the Middle East, for Iran and its future, whether it's nuclear capabilities or ballistic missile capabilities, what that therefore means for the U.S. interests in this region. But in terms of the signal sent by this conflict elsewhere, knowing, for example, that the U.S. has expended heavily munitions and that it may take some time to replenish those, especially if for whatever reason we have to go back in and strike again if the ceasefire can't hold. Does it not signal that despite military strength that may have been shown with this operation, that there could be some weakness ahead because we simply won't have those same stockpiles to fall back on?
Well, of course, stockpiles can be rebuilt. I think a lesson that a lot of people—
Doesn't that take years, though, General?
It depends on what we do with our defense industrial base, which is another question entirely. I think long before the conflict with Iran, there was a sense within this administration that the defense industrial base was too small, too inefficient to actually support the size of the force that we have in the field today against the requirements that we might have. And I believe a number of initiatives are underway to repair that right now. But go back to your original question. I think potential foes across the world are looking very thoughtfully at the success of the U.S. joint force in the campaign over the last 30 days. And yes, you're right. We have eaten into magazines, but I would note again, those magazines magazines can be replenished, and they can be replenished quickly depending on the level of emphasis we choose to put on it.
It's interesting to consider that emphasis, as we know the Pentagon is expected at least to make a $200 billion supplemental funding request on top of the $1.5 trillion defense budget the president already requested of Congress last week. Our defense industrial base obviously is a consideration here, but we heard at the Pentagon today from both the Joint Chief Chair and Defense Secretary Hegseth about the degradation of Iran's defense industrial base in particular, noting how they were specifically targeting sites that make drones, that make missiles. So what about Iran's capability to rebuild that if it so chooses?
So I think Iran's capabilities to build missiles, to build drones, very, very degraded. I don't read the classified information, so I don't know the details. But I would say this, that fact, coupled with our ability to maintain a persistent overhead presence over Iran, will give us very good visibility into the status of what's left of their industrial base. And we'll know very quickly if they choose to rebuild it. And that could lead us to other decisions in the future to restrike. All those things are possible. All of those things the Iranians are acutely aware of.
Well, and we've already heard about the surveillance that we have on the remaining nuclear sites and material after Operation Midnight Hammer. The defense secretary was talking about that today. We've had repeatedly suggestions that they could always go in and strike again if they needed to, which is why a diplomatic agreement around that enriched uranium is going to be so critical here. I also wonder, General, as we're considering the Middle East more widely, the idea that Iran has, and still today sporadically, was hitting other Gulf nations, that this was not just about U.S. assets or Israeli assets, that we have seen this spread elsewhere. If this has fundamentally reshaped the Middle East in some way, and even potentially had the effect of drawing some of these other Gulf states closer to Israel, if they may now see their interests as being more aligned.
No, you're absolutely right. The Iranian decision to strike unprovoked its neighbors in the Gulf is the equivalent of Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor. We were mobilized to fight Japan. It would have been hard for President Roosevelt to mobilize people against Germany. Hitler took the problem out of his hands by declaring war on the United States. That's a little of what the Iranians have done by attacking their neighbors across the region. What began with icy neutrality among those countries is now moving to support for our goals. And you're right, the clear long-term future in the region in terms of defense and a variety of other things is going to feature the continued integration of Israel into those activities. That's inevitable. And the Iranians have no one to blame for that but themselves.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if indeed the president does get the expansion of the Abraham Accords that he has long said he is seeking. Just on Israel, though, it is worth pointing out, General, that, of course, Israel right now says Lebanon is not part of this ceasefire, that it is going to continue its operations against Hezbollah. Clearly, that is not sitting well with Iran, who wants to see that front halted as well if there's to be ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. How should we consider Israel's position and the threat posed by Hezbollah right now in terms of how the region moves forward and how this particular ceasefire can move forward if it can?
Well, Lebanese Hezbollah poses a mortal threat to the existence of the state of Israel. They have sworn that for many years. Their activities over the decades have been very clear. And they've also been a parasite on the state of Lebanon. I think Israel's attacks are actually well justified going into Lebanon. We'll see what Iran does. I think Iran will actually think very long and hard before attacking Israel as a result of the ongoing operations that Israel's conducting in Lebanon. I think that would be a mistake for Iran to stand too strongly behind the idea of coupling what's going on in Lebanon to what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. That would be a mistake for them.